The crystal halls of the Imperial Archives stretched endlessly into the darkness, and Hierarch Sithel walked through them with growing unease in his heart. Something was wrong, and he could feel it in his bones like a cold wind from a forgotten grave. The Valorian Dominion had ruled the Orion Spur for 12,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever dared to refuse their demands. They were the masters of 1,000 worlds, the inheritors of ancient glory, the undisputed rulers of everything they could see among the stars. But now there was a problem, and the Council of Voices had summoned Sithal to address it. A small blue world at the edge of charted space had refused to pay tribute, and worse than that, they had sent back a message that made even the bravest admirals feel a chill run down their spines. Earth, they called it. A primitive world filled with primitive creatures who had barely discovered how to leave their own atmosphere. How dare they refuse the mighty Dominion? Sithal stopped before an ancient terminal, his clawed fingers trembling as he scrolled through records that should not exist. The archivists had warned him not to look, but he needed to understand why the elder counselors had gone pale when they heard the name of that little world. The records were fragmented and corrupted, as if someone had tried very hard to erase them. Whole sections were missing, replaced by warnings in languages so old that even the translation systems struggled to understand them. But bits and pieces remained, and what Sithal read made his blood run cold. There were stories of a species from that world, a species that had once walked among the stars before the Dominion even existed. The elder races called them the Unmourned, for no one dared to speak their true name. The Cathari refugees, ancient beings who lived in the shadows of the galaxy, whispered another title when they thought no one was listening. The Spite-born Legends, said a voice behind him. And Sithal turned to see Admiral Vexian striding into the archive chamber. The Admiral's chitinous armor gleamed under the crystal lights, and his mandibles clicked with obvious contempt. You waste your time reading fairy tales, Archon. These records are 12,000 years old, Sithal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. They speak of humans as if they were something to fear. Vexian laughed, and the sound echoed harshly through the ancient halls. Fear them? They are primitive apes who were playing with fire while our ancestors built empires that spanned galaxies. They refused our envoy. Yes, but that was merely the foolishness of creatures who do not understand their place in the universe. The Admiral pulled up a holographic display showing the diplomatic mission that had been sent to Earth 3 months ago. A Dominion ship had arrived in the human system carrying gifts and demands, as was proper when contacting lesser species. The humans were expected to bow, to offer tribute, to accept their role as servants of the greater civilization. Instead, something else had happened. The humans had taken the diplomatic offering, a carefully prepared feast of delicacies from across the Dominion, and they had eaten it. Then they had sent back the bones, cleaned and polished, and arranged in a pattern that the ship's eye had recognized as an ancient human symbol. A symbol that meant defiance, a symbol that meant war, and with the bones came a message, written in perfect Valorian script, despite the fact that humans should not know that language. We remember you. We have been waiting. What does that mean? Sithal demanded, his voice rising with fear he could not hide. How do they remember us? We have never contacted them before. A bluff, Vexian said dismissively. A pathetic attempt to frighten us with mystery and vague threats. I have seen it 100 times from 100 species, and they all learned the same lesson in the end. The Dominion does not negotiate with insects, but Sithal was not so sure, and he turned back to the ancient records, searching for something that might explain the cold certainty in those human words. What he found made him wish he had never looked. There was a warning buried deep in the archives, placed there by an AI so old that its creators had been dust for 10,000 years. The Watcher-class intelligence had been designed to guard the forbidden sectors of space, the places where the Dominion's ancestors had learned never to go. And when the Council had asked it about Earth, it had spoken 5 words before shutting down permanently, its core burning out as if destroyed by its own terror. You should not wake them. Sithel showed this to Vexian, but the Admiral only sneered. Malfunctioning equipment and corrupted data. You expect me to fear a species that still uses chemical rockets and radio waves. The Council has made its decision, High Archon. We will teach these humans their place, and you will watch as we do it. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet was assembled within the month, and it was a force that could shatter worlds. 200 warships of the line, each one capable of destroying a planet's surface in a matter of hours. 50 planet crackers, massive vessels designed to break worlds into pieces for easier mining. And at the center of it all, the flagship Eternal Sovereignty, a mobile fortress that had never known defeat in 3,000 years of service. Admiral Vexian stood on the bridge of the Eternal Sovereignty as the fleet prepared to jump toward Sol. And he felt nothing but confidence. The humans would learn, as all species learned, that resistance to the Dominion was not just futile, but laughable. They would bow or they would burn, and either way, the natural order would be restored. Set course for the human system, he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. We will arrive, we will demand their complete surrender, and we will crush them if they refuse. This will be over before the next cycle begins. The fleet jumped, 250 ships vanishing into hyperspace in a flash of light that could be seen from a dozen worlds. The Dominion subjects watched and trembled, grateful that such power was aimed at someone else. Surely no species could stand against such might, but in the darkness between stars, where the fleet traveled toward its destiny, something stirred. Sensors that had watched the galaxy for millennia detected the approaching ships. Ancient systems that had slumbered since before the Dominion's rise began to wake. And in the depths of a world that had pretended to be primitive for longer than most civilizations had existed, a single message was transmitted to every hidden station, every buried fleet, every waiting warrior. They are coming. After 12,000 years, they are finally coming. All stations prepare. All fleets activate. All weapons online. The message was received by humans who had lived for centuries. By AI systems that had been built before the precursors fell. By ships that had been hiding in the darkness since before the Valorian species had evolved. And everywhere, in the cold void of space, lights began to turn on. Earth had been watching the Dominion for 300 years. Ever since their scouts had first entered human space without knowing what they had found. Earth had been waiting, preparing, building weapons and ships and soldiers for a war that had been predicted 10,000 years ago. The Dominion thought they were coming to conquer a primitive world. They did not know that they were walking into a trap that had been set before their grandparents were born. They did not know that the legends they had dismissed were not just true but incomplete. They did not know that the galaxy's greatest predator had been pretending to sleep, waiting for exactly this moment. And somewhere in the archives of the Eternal Sovereignty, a corrupted file briefly uncorrupted itself, displaying a single image that no one was watching, a human face, ancient beyond measure, smiling with the patience of a hunter who has waited lifetimes for prey to finally step into the snare. The hunt was about to begin. But the Dominion did not know that they were not the hunters. They were the prey, and they had been prey since before they learned to walk upright. The legends had tried to warn them, but they had not listened then. Now they would learn why some legends should stay buried, and why the galaxy had tried so hard to forget what humanity had done the last time someone tried to conquer them. The crystal halls of the Imperial Archives stretched endlessly into the darkness, and High Archon Sithel walked through them with growing unease in his heart. Something was wrong, and he could feel it in his bones like a cold wind from a forgotten grave. The Valorian Dominion had ruled the Orion Spur for 12 1,000 years. And in all that time, no species had ever dared to refuse their demands. They were the masters of 1,000 worlds, the inheritors of ancient glory, the undisputed rulers of everything they could see among the stars. But now there was a problem, and the Council of Voices had summoned Sithal to address it. A small blue world at the edge of charted space had refused to pay tribute, and worse than that, they had sent back a message that made even the bravest admirals feel a chill run down their spines. Earth, they called it. A primitive world filled with primitive creatures who had barely discovered how to leave their own atmosphere. How dare they refuse the mighty Dominion? Sithal stopped before an ancient terminal, his clawed fingers trembling as he scrolled through records that should not exist. The archivists had warned him not to look, but he needed to understand why the elder counselors had gone pale when they heard the name of that little world. The records were fragmented and corrupted. As if someone had tried very hard to erase them, whole sections were missing, replaced by warnings in Lingua. The Third Expeditionary Fleet emerged from hyperspace beyond the 8th planet of the Sol system. An Admiral Vexian allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as his sensor arrays painted the surrounding space with brilliant streams of data. This was going to be even easier than he had expected. The readings showed exactly what the Dominion's intelligence had predicted. Primitive electromagnetic signals bouncing between worlds. Chemical propulsion signatures from crude rockets. A civilization that had barely begun to crawl toward the stars. The humans had a few stations around their inner planets and some mining operations in the asteroid belt. But nothing that could threaten even the smallest ship in his fleet. Pathetic, Vexian declared, his mandibles clicking with amusement as his officers gathered around the tactical display. They have not even detected our arrival. We could destroy their entire civilization before they knew we were here. His second in command, a younger officer named Kreth, studied the data with a slight frown. Admiral, there is something strange about these readings. The distribution of mass in this system does not match standard models. There appears to be more material in the outer regions than there should be. Asteroids and debris, Vexian said dismissively. Every system has irregularities. Focus on the mission, Kreth. We will advance to the 3rd planet and deliver our ultimatum. If the humans do not surrender within one rotation, we will begin bombardment of their population centers. The fleet began its advance. 250 ships moving in perfect formation toward the inner system. The crews were relaxed and confident, many of them viewing this as little more than a training exercise against a helpless enemy. Some were already discussing what they would take as trophies from the conquered world. But as the fleet crossed the orbit of the 8th planet, something changed. The sensor readings flickered, distorted, and then reformed into something completely different. The primitive signals vanished, replaced by emissions so complex that the Dominion system struggled to even categorize them. The chemical propulsion signatures disappeared, and in their place were energy patterns that should not exist. Admiral, Kreth shouted, his voice rising with sudden fear. The readings are changing. This is not possible. Vexian stared at the display, his confidence crumbling as he watched what was happening. The shell of primitive technology was falling away, revealing something underneath that made his heart stop beating for a terrible moment. What the Dominion had detected was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion designed to make Earth look weak and harmless. The humans had been broadcasting false signals, hiding their true capabilities behind a mask of technological infancy. And now that mask was falling away. Thousands of objects that had registered as asteroids and debris began to move. They were not rocks at all, but ships, stations, weapons platforms that had been dormant for centuries. The asteroid belt itself seemed to come alive as massive structures emerged from hiding places carved into the largest rocks. And everywhere Vexian looked, lights were turning on by the Ancient Ones, whispered one of his officers. "How many ships are there?" The sensors tried to count them and failed. There were too many, appearing too fast, emerging from places that should have been empty. Some of them were small and fast, darting through space like predators scenting blood. Others were enormous, dwarfing even the planet crackers that were the pride of the Dominion fleet, and meant a transmission cut through every frequency, bypassing every encryption, speaking directly into the minds of every Dominion soldier in the fleet. It was a human voice, cold and calm and utterly without fear. "This is Fleet Admiral Chen Wei of the Terran Continuity. You stand in sovereign space, and your presence here is an act of war. Your ancestors came to this system once before, 12,000 years ago, when they called themselves the Precursor Dominion. They thought they would enslave a young species that was just learning to farm and build cities." The voice paused, and when it continued, the temperature on every Dominion bridge seemed to drop by several degrees. "There are no precursors anymore. We made sure of that. Turn back now, or join them in the extinction that they earned." Vexian's shock lasted only a moment before it transformed into rage. How dare these creatures threaten the Dominion? How dare they claim to have destroyed the Precursors, the legendary civilization that had ruled the galaxy before the Valorians rose to power? "A bluff," he snarled, slamming his fist against the command console. "They are trying to frighten us with lies and tricks. All ships, advance to attack formation. We will show these humans what happens to those who threaten the Dominion." The fleet surged forward, weapons charging, shields at maximum power. The Dominion had conquered 1,000 worlds, and they would not be turned back by words and light shows from a primitive species. The first wave of fighters launched from the carrier ships, 500 of the fastest attack craft in the galaxy screaming toward the human positions. They were piloted by veterans of a dozen wars, equipped with weapons that could cut through any known defense. They would clear a path for the main fleet and prove that the Dominion was still the master of the stars. The fighters never reached their targets. One moment they were there, racing through space in perfect formation. The next moment they were gone. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply vanished. Sensors showed no weapons fire, no missiles, no beams of any kind. The fighters had simply ceased to exist, pulled into something that the Dominion's instruments could not identify or understand. What happened? Vexian demanded, staring at the empty space where 500 of his soldiers had been. Where did they go? No one could answer him because no one understood. The humans had not fired any visible weapon. They had simply erased the fighters from reality, as casually as someone might brush dust from their uniform, and then the remembrance emerged from behind the largest planet in the system. It was a ship unlike anything the Dominion had ever seen, so massive that it defied the laws of physics that the Valorians thought they understood. It was larger than some moons, covered in armor that seemed to drink in light and never give it back. And across its hull were markings that made Vexian's blood freeze in his veins. They were symbols from 100 different civilizations, arranged in patterns that told a terrible story. Each symbol represented a species that had once challenged humanity, and each one was extinct. The markings were not decorations, but trophies, warnings carved into the skin of a predator that wanted its prey to understand exactly what they were facing. "Admiral," Greth said, his voice barely audible, "I am detecting energy signatures from that ship that our systems cannot even classify. It has weapons that we have no defense against. We need to retreat. We do not retreat." Vexian screamed, but his voice was shaking now. "We are the Dominion. We do not run from primitives." The human transmission came again, still calm, still cold, still utterly confident. "You were warned. You chose not to listen. Now you will learn why the galaxy forgot about us. You will learn why your ancestors tried so hard to erase every record of what happened when they came to our world. You will learn why legends should stay buried. The remembrance opened fire beams of energy that burned with colors the Dominion had no names for lanced across space, and every ship they touched simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris, no wreckage. The vessels simply vanished, erased from reality as if they had never been built. Missiles launched from hidden platforms. But they were not missiles in any sense the Dominion understood. They phased through shields as if those shields did not exist. They tracked targets with intelligence that suggested they were alive. And when they struck, they did not explode. Instead, they aged their targets, turning new ships into ancient wrecks in moments. Crews becoming dust before they could even scream, and through it all, the human ships moved in ways that should have been impossible. They did not obey inertia or momentum. They appeared and disappeared at will, striking from angles that did not exist. They fought as if the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules, as if they had transcended the limitations that bound every other species in the galaxy. The Battle of Sol had begun, and within the first hour, the Dominion had lost a quarter of its fleet. Vexian stood on his bridge, watching his empire's pride burn in the void, and he finally understood the truth that the archives had tried to tell him. The legends were real. The humans were not primitive at all, and the Dominion had just made the worst mistake in its 12,000-year history. They had woken something that should have been left sleeping, and now they would learn why the galaxy had tried so hard to forget. Fleet Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the Remembrance, watching the Dominion fleet scramble into defensive formations through holographic displays that showed every ship, every movement, every desperate attempt to find some way to survive. Around her, the awakening of humanity's true military continued. Forces that had been hidden for millennia emerging from shadows that no other species had known existed. She was old, far older than any human should be able to live. Her body sustained by technologies that the galaxy had never seen. She had been born 300 years after the precursors fell, raised on stories of what those monsters had done to her ancestors, trained in weapons and tactics that had been developed to ensure that no one would ever hurt humanity again. And now, after all these centuries of waiting, the enemy had finally come. "Status report," she said, her voice calm despite the battle raging around her ship. "The Dominion has lost 40% of its fleet," her tactical officer reported. A young man named James, who had only been awake for 50 years. "They are attempting to regroup around their flagship. Their planet crackers are charging weapons, probably planning to threaten Earth directly." Chen Wei nodded slowly, unsurprised by this development. The Dominion commanders were thinking like every other species humanity had faced. When conventional weapons failed, they always turned to threats against civilians, believing that the fear of mass death would force surrender. They did not understand that humanity had already experienced the worst that the galaxy could offer. They did not know that threats only made humans more determined to fight. And they certainly did not know what would happen to anyone who pointed a weapon at Earth. "Let them charge their weapons," she said quietly. "Let them believe they have leverage. And then show them what we did to the last civilization that threatened our homeworld." The bridge crew exchanged glances, some of them young enough to have only read about the Precursor War in history files. They knew the stories, that they had never seen the full extent of human capability. Today they would learn why their ancestors had chosen to hide rather than rule. Earth remembered everything. 12,000 years ago, when humanity was young and innocent, the Precursor Dominion had arrived in ships that blotted out the sun. They had been the rulers of the galaxy then, a civilization so powerful that they viewed all other species as nothing more than resources to be exploited. And when they found Earth, with its billions of primitive humans who had just begun to build cities and grow crops, They had seen only slaves. The occupation lasted 3 centuries, and it was worse than any nightmare that humans had ever imagined. The precursors took millions from their homes and transported them to distant worlds where they worked until they died. They conducted experiments on human bodies and minds, trying to understand how to make better slaves. They burned cities for entertainment, hunted humans for sport, treated an entire species as if they were animals without souls. Chen Wei knew the stories intimately, because she had been taught them by people who had lived through those times. The Terran continuity preserved not just technology but memory, passing down the experiences of the precursor era so that no human would ever forget what had been done to them. Something in humanity broke during those centuries of torment. The innocence that they had carried was burned away, replaced by something harder and darker. But something else was forged in that fire, a determination that went beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. The survivors did not just want to be free. They wanted to ensure that nothing like the precursors could ever threaten them again. They began to fight back, at first in small ways that the precursors barely noticed. Humans stole technology and learned to understand it faster than should have been possible. They reverse-engineered weapons that had taken other species millennia to develop and improved them within decades. They shared knowledge across continents using methods the precursors never detected, building a resistance that grew stronger with every passing year. And then the uprising began. Chen Wei pulled up a historical display that she had watched 1,000 times, showing what happened when humanity finally revealed its true capabilities. The precursors had built an empire that spanned half the galaxy, with fleets that numbered in the millions and technology that could reshape worlds. They believed themselves invincible. They were wrong. Humanity developed weapons that no sane species would ever create, devices that broke the laws of physics because humans refused to accept limitations. They built ships that could tear holes in reality, bombs that could erase matter from existence, plagues that targeted specific genetic patterns. They fought with a fury that terrified even their allies, throwing themselves into battles that should have been impossible to win. The war lasted 3 centuries, and when it ended, there were no precursors left. Not a single survivor, not a single colony, not a single ship. Humanity had hunted them across the galaxy and destroyed them so completely that even their name was eventually forgotten. The species that had tormented Earth was erased from history, as if they had never existed. And then humanity stood among the ashes of their victory and made a choice that would shape the next 12,000 years. They could rule the galaxy. They had the power, the technology, the will. No species could have stopped them from claiming dominion over everything they could reach. But they had seen what empire did to the soul. They had experienced firsthand what happened when one civilization decided that others existed only to serve them. And they refused to become the monsters they had destroyed. Instead, they retreated. They hid their true capabilities behind a mask of primitive technology. They let the younger races rise and fall, watching from the shadows, pruning civilizations that grew too cruel, guiding those that showed promise. They became gardeners of the galaxy, invisible and patient, waiting for the day when the universe might be ready for their return. But they never forgot what had been done to them. And they never forgave, Admiral, James said, interrupting her memories. The Dominion flagship is hailing us. Chen Wei smiled without warmth and opened the channel. The face that appeared on her display was clearly terrified. A Valorian officer whose confidence had been shattered by the destruction he had witnessed. "I am High Archon Sithel," the alien said, his voice trembling. "I demand to know what you are. Our records say that humans are primitive, but this is clearly not true. Who are you really?" "We are exactly what your records say we are," Chen Wei replied calmly. "We are humans. We are the species that your ancestors tried to enslave 12,000 years ago. We are the children of those who suffered and died in precursor slave pits. And we are the descendants of those who rose up and destroyed your precious precursors so completely that even their name has been forgotten." Sithal's face went pale. "The precursors were destroyed by a natural disaster. That is what the histories say." "The histories lie," Chanwei said. "We made sure of that. We erased the records, corrupted the archives, spread false stories across the galaxy. We did not want the younger races to know what we were capable of, because we hoped that we would never have to show them." She leaned forward, and something ancient and terrible flickered in her eyes. "But you came to our home and demanded tribute. You threatened our children and called us primitives. You woke something that should have been left sleeping. And now you will learn what happens when humanity stops pretending to be weak." The remembrance began to sing, a frequency that resonated with something buried deep in the genetic memory of every living being. Across the Dominion fleet, soldiers began to remember things that their conscious minds had never known. Ancestral memories, passed down through countless generations, of a time when their forebears had fled screaming from a small blue world. They remembered the fear. They remembered the ships that came out of nowhere. They remembered the weapons that could not be stopped. They remembered the humans, marching through the ruins of precursor cities with expressions of cold satisfaction on their faces. The Dominion had not just inherited the precursors' territory. They had inherited their terror. "Your planet crackers are useless," Chen Wei said, watching the Dominion crews collapse as the memories overwhelmed them. "Your shields cannot stop us. Your weapons cannot harm us. You have nothing that can threaten Earth, and you never did. We allowed you to come here because we wanted to see if you had learned from your ancestors' mistakes." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You have not learned, but you will." The battle resumed, but it was no longer a contest. It was an education, a demonstration of power so complete that the survivors would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The Dominion had thought they were conquering a primitive world, and instead they had discovered why the galaxy's greatest predator had chosen to hide humanity, had not buried the legends because they were ashamed. They had buried them because the truth would have made every other species too afraid to ever approach them. They had wanted neighbors, not subjects. Allies, not slaves. And they had been willing to wait millennia for the galaxy to be ready, but the Dominion had not been ready. And now they would pay the price for their arrogance. High Archon Sithal watched the battle through the Eternal Sovereignty's failing sensors, and everything he had believed about the universe crumbled around him like dust in a storm. The Third Fleet, the pride of the Valorian Dominion, was being systematically unmade by creatures that should have been primitives. That human ships moved in ways that violated every law of physics that Sithal understood. They did not drift or coast through space like normal vessels. Instead, they appeared and disappeared at will, striking from impossible angles, retreating before counterattacks could be launched. They fought as if inertia and momentum were obstacles for lesser species, as if they had transcended the limitations that bound every other civilization in the galaxy, and their weapons were nightmares made. Real beams of energy that erased matter from existence, cut through Dominion ships like knives through water. Missiles that should have been stopped by shields simply phased through defensive barriers as if those barriers did not exist. Drones appeared from nowhere, multiplying faster than they could be destroyed. Overwhelming point defense systems with sheer numbers, but worse than the technology was the psychology behind it. Humans were not fighting like a desperate species defending their homeworld. There was no fear in their tactics, no hesitation in their movements. They fought like apex predators who had been bored for millennia and were finally experiencing the thrill of a hunt. Their ships moved with the casual confidence of creatures who knew they could not lose, and they knew things that they should not. Nosithal watched in horror. as human vessels targeted specific weak points in Dominion shields, exploited flaws in engine designs that were supposed to be classified, used frequencies that bypassed communications encryption that had never been broken. It was as if they had been studying the Dominion for centuries, learning every secret, cataloging every vulnerability, waiting for this moment. The truth hit him like a physical blow. They had been watching. For hundreds of years, probably longer, the humans had been observing the Dominion from the shadows. They had infiltrated databases, intercepted communications, analyzed technology. They had allowed the Empire to grow and expand. Knowing that one day it would come to them, they had been waiting for prey to walk into a trap that had been set before Sithal's grandparents were born. Admiral Vexian is dead, someone reported, voice hollow with shock. His ship was destroyed in the last attack. We have lost all of our planet crackers and 70% of our fleet. Sithal did not respond. What could he say? They had come here expecting to conquer primitives and had discovered something far worse. They had found a species that had been playing with them from the beginning. A civilization that had pretended to be weak while building weapons that could destroy gods. A flash of light appeared on the bridge, and when it faded, there was a human standing before him, not a hologram, not a projection, but an actual physical presence that had somehow bypassed every shield and security system on the flagship. His guards raised their weapons and fired, but the energy beams passed through the human like she was made of smoke. She did not even flinch. "Hello, High Archon," the human said, and her voice was calm and cold and ancient. "I am Ambassador Yuki Tanaka of the First Generation. I was alive when your precursor ancestors came to Earth. I watched them burn my village and take my family to their slave ships. And I was one of the first to take back what they stole from us." Sithal stared at her, trying to understand what he was seeing. She looked old, impossibly old, but her eyes burned with a fire that seemed to defy time itself. There was something in her gaze that made him want to fall to his knees and beg for mercy. "That is not possible," he whispered. "No species can live for 12,000 years. Humanity learned many things during our time under precursor rule," Tanaka replied, walking slowly toward him. "We learned how to manipulate our own genetics, how to repair cellular damage, how to transfer consciousness between bodies. We learned how to survive in ways that your ancestors never anticipated. And some of us chose to keep living, to watch over our people, to ensure that no one would ever hurt us again." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the weight of centuries in her expression. "Your fleet is destroyed. Your planet crackers have been repurposed. In approximately 4 minutes, they will fire on your own homeworld, unless you transmit an unconditional surrender to every system in the Dominion." Sithal felt his heart stop. "You would murder billions of innocent people?" "I would do nothing compared to what your ancestors did to us," Tanaka said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a terrible patience. "The precursors killed over 1 billion humans during their occupation. They tortured and experimented on millions more. They treated our entire species as cattle to be used and discarded. Do not speak to me of innocence." She paused, and something shifted in her ancient eyes. "But humanity has evolved beyond simple vengeance. We learned long ago that cruelty only creates more cruelty, that hatred only breeds more hatred. We destroyed the precursors because we had to, because they would never have stopped hurting us. But we did not enjoy it, and we did not want to do it again." Tanaka leaned closer, and Sithal saw something behind her eyes that made him truly understand what he was facing. It was the collective memory of 10,000 years of preparation, the focused will of a species that had suffered genocide and emerged from it stronger than before. It was the gaze of beings who had seen the worst the universe could offer and had refused to be broken by it. "We offer you a choice that the precursors never gave us," she said quietly. Surrender and learn, or burn and be forgotten. Accept your defeat with grace, and we will help your people become something better than they are. Resist, and we will do to your civilization what we did to our oppressors. The decision is yours. Sithal looked at the displays showing the remnants of his fleet, the burning wrecks that had once been the mightiest warships in the galaxy. He thought about the families on his homeworld, the billions who had nothing to do with this invasion but would die if he refused. He thought about the legends that had tried to warn him, the archives that had been corrupted to hide the truth, and he thought about what kind of leader he wanted to be. If I surrender, he asked slowly, what happens to my people? You will be held accountable for the crimes your military has committed, Tanaka replied. But the civilian population will not be punished. We will send teachers and diplomats, not soldiers and executioners. Your empire will become a republic, governed by laws rather than conquest. And over time, if you prove worthy, you will be welcomed as partners in building something better. She smiled, and for the first time there was warmth in her expression. We've been watching the galaxy for 12,000 years, High Archon. We have seen civilizations rise and fall, seen empires build and crumble. And we have learned that fear is a cage that imprisons both the fearful and the feared. We do not want subjects. We want neighbors. We want friends. Sithal closed his eyes, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. The Dominion had existed for 12,000 years, built on conquest and pride, and the belief that strength gave the right to rule. Everything he had been taught said that surrender was shame, that defeat was death. But he was not just a soldier. He was a leader. And leaders sometimes had to make choices that hurt in order to protect those who depended on them. How do I know you will keep your word? He asked, opening his eyes. Tanaka's smile widened. You do not. Trust is earned, not given. But consider this. We have had the power to destroy your civilization for 300 years, and we chose not to use it. We have been watching you grow, hoping that you would be different from your ancestors. We wanted to be wrong about you. She gestured toward the viewport, where Earth hung in the distance, blue and beautiful and terrifying. We could have ruled the galaxy. We could have made every species bow to us. But we remembered what empire felt like from the other side, and we refused to become what we had destroyed. That choice is the only proof I can offer. That choice is who we are. The surrender came with 3 minutes to spare. Sithal transmitted the order to every ship, every station, every system in the Dominion. Unconditional capitulation, full acceptance of Terran authority, immediate cessation of all hostile activities. The war was over before it had truly begun. But as the human ships moved to secure the survivors, as medical teams began treating wounded Dominion soldiers, as diplomats prepared to negotiate the terms of peace, Sithal found himself thinking about something Tanaka had said. They had been hoping the Dominion would be different from the precursors. They had been watching and waiting, giving the younger species a chance to prove themselves. And they had been disappointed. What would it take, he wondered, to earn the trust of beings who had been betrayed by the galaxy once before? What would his people have to become to be worthy of the second chance they had been given? He did not know. But as he watched the humans work efficiently to save lives that had been trying to kill them moments before, he began to understand something that his ancestors had never grasped. True strength was not measured by the power to destroy. It was measured by the choice not to use that power when mercy was possible. And humanity, for all their terrible capabilities, had chosen mercy. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Sol, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Valorian Dominion still existed, but it was no longer an empire. It had become a constitutional republic under Terran observation, its military reduced to a defense force, its government restructured to represent all of its citizens rather than just its conquering elite. The truth of the Precursors had been revealed to every species in known space, transmitted through networks that humanity had secretly maintained for millennia. The galaxy learned what had really happened 12,000 years ago, how a tyrannical civilization had tormented countless young species, how humanity had united the survivors into a resistance that should have been impossible, how the war of extinction had lasted 3 centuries and ended with the complete annihilation of the precursor race. The humans had kept this secret for longer than most civilizations had existed. They had allowed new empires to rise and fall, seeding them with just enough knowledge to advance, pruning them when they grew too cruel. They had been gardeners of the galaxy, invisible and patient, watching and waiting for the day when they might step back into the light. That day had finally come. Ambassador Yuki Tanaka stood before the newly formed Galactic Assembly in a chamber that had been built specifically for this moment. Representatives from 300 species filled the seats around her, beings of every shape and size and origin, all united by a common purpose: to understand what humanity wanted and what the future would hold. Behind her, visible through the massive viewport that formed the chamber's ceiling, the remembrance hung in orbit. It was a reminder to everyone present that the universe's greatest power had chosen peace, but had not forgotten how to make war. No one in the assembly needed to be told what would happen if this new alliance failed. "Thank you all for gathering here today," Tanaka began, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber through technology that was older than most of the species listening. "I know that many of you are afraid. You have learned things about humanity that were hidden for millennia, and you are uncertain what our intentions might be." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled representatives. Some met her eyes with curiosity, others with fear, a few with barely concealed hostility. All of them were waiting to hear what the humans would demand, what price they would exact for the power they had demonstrated. "We could rule you," she said simply. "We have the technology, the weapons, the experience. No coalition of your species could defeat us. No alliance could resist our power. If we wanted to claim dominion over the galaxy, there is nothing that could stop us." The chamber was silent. This was what they had feared, the inevitable moment when the humans revealed their true intentions. Some of the representatives began to calculate how quickly they could evacuate their homeworlds, how far they would have to run to escape. "But we will not rule you," Tanaka continued, and she smiled at the confusion that spread across 100 faces. "We learned long ago that empire is a poison that destroys the conqueror as surely as the conquered. The precursors were powerful beyond imagination, and their power made them cruel. They believed that strength gave them the right to dominate, that other species existed only to serve their needs. And that belief led them to extinction." She walked slowly across the speaker's platform, her ancient body moving with a grace that belied her years. "Humanity spent 3 centuries as slaves. We experienced firsthand what it means to be powerless, to have no choice, to watch your loved ones suffer and die for the entertainment of those stronger than you. And when we finally won our freedom, we swore that we would never inflict that suffering on anyone else. We could have conquered the galaxy when the precursors fell. Our fleets were already spread across 1,000 systems. Our technology was centuries ahead of anyone else. But we chose to retreat instead. We hid our capabilities, let the younger races develop on their own, watched from the shadows as new civilizations rose and fell. We did this because we wanted neighbors, not subjects. We wanted to build relationships based on mutual respect, not fear and submission. We wanted to prove to ourselves that we were better than our oppressors. That suffering had made us wise rather than cruel." Tanaka stopped at the center of the platform and faced the assembly directly. "That is why we are here today. Not to demand tribute or obedience, but to offer partnership. The galaxy is vast and there is room for all of us to grow, to explore, to become more than we currently are. Humanity has knowledge that we are willing to share, technology that could benefit everyone, experience that might help younger species avoid the mistakes we have made. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. We ask only one thing in return. The assembly waited, barely breathing. This was the moment of truth, the revelation of what the humans really wanted. Remember, Tanaka said quietly. Remember what cruelty creates. Remember that the victims of today may become the judges of tomorrow. Remember that somewhere in the dark between stars, there are always those who wait. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of 12,000 years of memory. The precursors thought they were invincible. They believed that their power made them immune to consequences. And they paid for that arrogance with extinction. The Dominion made the same mistake, and they would have suffered the same fate if they had not surrendered. We buried the legends of what we did because we did not want to rule through fear. We wanted to be forgotten so that we could be reborn. But now the truth is known, and we must all decide together what kind of future we want to build. She smiled. And for the first time since the assembly began, there was genuine warmth in her expression. The legends warned you about humanity. Every species in this room grew up hearing stories about the monsters that lurked in the darkness, the ancient terrors that destroyed civilizations and vanished into the void. But legends are just stories we tell to help us sleep at night. The truth is that we are not your enemies. We are not your gods. We are simply your neighbors, older perhaps, wiser in some ways, certainly more patient. We have been waiting for the galaxy to be ready for us, waiting for a time when we could step out of the shadows without causing panic and destruction. Tanaka extended her hand toward the assembly, a gesture that humans had used for thousands of years to show peace and friendship. We believe that time has finally come. We believe that you are ready to meet us not as conquerors or saviors, but as equals. And we invite you to join us in building something that has never existed before, a galactic community based on cooperation rather than domination, on friendship rather than fear. Will you accept our offer? The silence stretched for a long moment, and then something remarkable happened. One by one, the representatives began to stand. Some were hesitant, some were eager, but all of them rose to their feet in a gesture of acceptance that transcended species and culture. It was not unanimous. Some remained seated, unwilling or unable to trust. But they were few, and they were quiet. The majority had made their choice, and that choice was hope. Tanaka watched them with tears in her ancient eyes. And for the first time in 12,000 years, she allowed herself to believe that it might actually work. Humanity had carried the burden of its past for so long, hiding in the darkness, waiting for a chance to be something other than monsters. And now that chance had finally arrived, thank you, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. We will not waste it. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in vaults that had been sealed since before the precursor invasion, the Watcher A's continued their eternal vigilance. They monitored the peace talks and diplomatic missions. They tracked every ship and signal and whisper of discontent. They watched and waited and remembered, and in the deepest vault of all, behind barriers that would require a supernova to breach, the true weapons of humanity's darkest age slumbered in silence. Devices that had broken the precursors, technologies that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. Horrors that humanity had created in desperation and locked away in hope that they would never be needed again. The galaxy had learned why legends stay buried. They had seen a glimpse of what humanity could do when threatened, but they had not seen everything. The darkest secrets remained hidden, known only to the Watchers and a handful of immoral guardians who prayed that those secrets would never be needed. But the weapons were there, just in case. Sleeping but not forgotten. Waiting but not dead, humanity had chosen peace. They had extended their hand in friendship. They had promised to be neighbors rather than conquerors, and they meant every word of that promise with all their ancient hearts. But they were also survivors of genocide, veterans of a war that had lasted 3 centuries, descendants of slaves who had learned to never be victims again. And while they hoped for the best, they were always prepared for the worst. The galaxy had been given a second chance. Humanity had been given a new beginning. And together, they might build something beautiful, or they might not. The future was unwritten, and there were no guarantees, but one thing was certain. If anyone ever tried to threaten humanity again, if anyone ever forgot the lessons of the precursors and the Dominion, if anyone ever decided that conquest was preferable to cooperation,